dispelling those thoughts. Well, the idea of this sort of contemplation, if we just do it just for a second, it's going to be a little bit artificial, of course, because you're listening to my voice, but when you meditate and you're actually doing it in a quiet room, you're just concentrating on your breathing. And so if you just imagine that that was the case, you were just sitting alone and you're just concentrating on your breathing. So that's the moment I want to try to get to. So when you're doing that, your brain is actually controlling your breathing apparatus without you doing anything at all. Every second or so, the muscle at the bottom of your rib cage called the diaphragm is pulling down. The air is going from the atmosphere into your lungs. 20% oxygen, just a little bit more than the oxygen that's in your blood, and oxygen is passing into your bloodstream. And carbon dioxide is being exchanged for that. And your blood is being pumped around your body with this amazing heart that we have beating in our chest that has been going for since you were about 4 weeks old, and it will continue without fail until the day you die. It's an amazing thing. And if you ate recently, that food that's in your stomach, I had a piece of birthday cake just a few minutes ago, and it's now being digested in my intestines probably, so the sugar is being released into my bloodstream. That blood is being pumped around my body to my muscles and my skin, and that's a pretty amazing thought, really, without you doing anything. We are living inside this fantastic machine that is capable of all of this stuff without any effort at all. And on top of all of that, we have something even more amazing. All the animals in the world that live on land are capable of doing what I just described. But we uniquely, perhaps uniquely in the entire universe, as far as we know, have a brain that is capable of thinking about such things and contemplating where we came from and how amazing that is. So that's really the first point I want to say, and that is that you are amazing. And you know, you can open your eyes now, by the way. So as you open your eyes, your visual system is bringing in all this information from the room, and your eyes are flickering around, but you're not feeling nauseous. Your brain has got a model of the room, and it's being updated every few milliseconds by this image. So it's an amazing thing that we're doing. So the question is then, where did we get this from? How come we're so amazing? Where did we come from? And that's really what this talk is about. So this was your origin, about 9 months before you were born. A tiny little speck from your father containing nothing more really than a packet of DNA met this massive, this slide doesn't give you credit, but 80,000 times bigger cell from your mother, from which you got all of your cell membranes, your mitochondria, all the stuff inside all of your cells came from your mother. And that was your origin. And then, incredibly, over the next few weeks after that fertilization occurred, you built yourself from that one cell to this little organism that looks like a human being. And you did that with the DNA encoded into your genes, without any effort, automatically. Now that's absolutely amazing how that happened. And of course, we all did that. So in answering the question, where did we come from? It really then only puts it off one generation, because of course it only begs then the question, well, where did your parents come from? And here's quite an old picture of me and my wife and our 4 kids, and behind us you can see our parents. So for our kids, our parents were their grandparents. And if you go back a generation, we call them great-grandparents. And if you go back another generation, we call them great-grandparents. And of course, or great-great in this case, so of course, you know, you could go back and back and back to find the ultimate answers where we came from and what are we humans. And if you know, the question is really how many greats would you have to go back before we come to a common ancestor for all of us? Those of us that are from Europe, you know, I'm from Europe, my family's from Europe, so you don't have to go back many generations before you meet a person that was the last common ancestor of all of the Europeans. And in fact, you don't have to go back even many more generations before you find the common ancestor of every single person on the planet. And this image here, taken from National Geographic, beautifully shows this migration of humans out of Africa, which we believe started around 200,000 years ago. So You can see the migration into Australia, the original Aboriginal people that arrived in Australia arrived there before even the Europeans, the humans arrived in Europe. So it's quite an amazing thing. But even this doesn't really answer the ultimate question. Where did humans come from? Where did any species come from? And when you're thinking about, your body, about your heart, about your lungs, about your limbs, it really begs the question, what on earth happened? Where did that come from? Now, in biology, when we have questions like this, there's a saying that a famous biology teacher in America is very famous for, and he basically said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And ultimately, if you want to understand why we have 5 fingers, why we have forward-facing eyes, anything to do with our biology or anything to do with life on the planet, the answer has to be found by looking at evolution. Now, I'm talking here, of course, about Darwin's famous theory of evolution. He's the person that's attributed it most often. But we shouldn't forget another guy called Russell Wallace, who did a lot of work and probably jointly should be given as much credit as Charles Darwin about this idea. Now, the idea itself is very well understood and very well known now. And I'm not going to spend long on this, but I just want to emphasize that there is a lot of evidence for evolution. One of the first things that Darwin talked about was artificial selection. So humans ourselves, in just a few thousand years, have generated lots of diversity and animals and plants just for us. And we can see lots of evidence for that. Here we can see sort of a genealogy of dogs, the breeds of dog around that you all see. We've all seen dogs that are tiny and dogs that are huge. There seems to be a huge variation. And we know that all of these dogs originally were just evolved from a wolf under human selection. And just to take one other example, there are thousands of examples of this. If we think of the food that you eat, a cauliflower, a cabbage, Brussels sprouts, all of these come from the same original plant. And through selective breeding, we've made them the way we want them to be. So we've got this the selection that we want. And it's not just humans that are doing this selection. In the biological world, we see evidence for what we call co-evolution, where 2 different species are selecting things in the other species, a bit like we are with these foods, and we get a similar sort of thing. So flowers and insects are the classic example where you see co-evolution going on. And evolution is quick. We can actually see evolution in our own lifetime. Flu and bacteria evolve very quickly because they have so many generations. But even in the animal world, we see this in Australia, where the cane toad was introduced, about 1920, and when it first came in, predators like the black snake thought it was just a toad that they could eat, and all of them sort of died. And so what's happened in just 60 or 70 years, we've seen that snakes have evolved to be smaller, because the ones that are not, don't have a big enough jaw to take a full dose of a large cane toad that would kill it, they're the ones that have survived. So the jaw size of the black snake has actually gone down over the last 60, 70 years. So cane toad is another piece of evidence. Now, of course, fossil evidence is something you all associate, or we've all associated with evolution. There's very good evidence of dinosaurs and fossils going extinct and changing over time, and new species emerging. This fossil here is Archaeopteryx, which is the species that we think was intermediate between reptiles and birds. So it's a nice example of the evolution of flight. So you can see there's lots of evidence, and the other 2 that I will talk about a little bit more is embryology, and the most important one that I'm going to talk about for this talk is the tree of life itself. Now, if you want to know more about this, there's a great book by Richard Dawkins, who's probably the world's leading sort of expert on all this stuff, and he wrote this book called The Greatest Show on Earth, which is all about the theory of evolution and the evidence for it. And this book on the bottom there, The Ancestor's Tale, is another book I would highly recommend, and a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about is taken from that. So let's talk about this embryology. When we looked at that amazing sort of sequence of pictures of our embryo forming that you built yourself in the first few weeks of your life, On the right-hand side there, you can see a human with just a couple of those images. And the point about embryology is it echoes, it gives you an echo of our evolutionary past. This three-word phrase is something I would recommend that everyone should try to learn to impress your friends. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And if it looks like a bit of a mouthful, this is what it really means. It just says, well, embryological growth seems to follow the tree of life. So, you know, we all originated from a single cell, and that's how life started. When the embryo starts to form, it looks a little bit like a worm. It becomes segmented, and then it bends over and starts to, little limbs start, looks like a fish maybe, and then it starts to look more like a mammal, and then it starts to look more like a human. And every species, you can see this same sort of progression as the embryo develops. So I think that's a really nice piece of evidence. But the most important one, and certainly the most visible one for all of us, is the tree of life itself. And so that's really what most of this talk is about. Now this image here was taken from a fantastic website that I just came across just a few weeks ago. I was looking for some images for this presentation. So I would recommend anyone go to this website. You don't have to remember that in full, just Google Evo and Geneo, as in genealogy, and you'll be taken to this website. And it's very interactive. You can sort of click on a species and it shows you the last common ancestor of humans with that species and what that particular species might have looked like. So it's a really great resource, and that's what I've used. And all of this is using Dawkins' ancestor's tale, the book that I was talking about a second ago. So to get your head around this tree of life, there's a couple of sort of biological things we've got to try and understand. It does get a little bit technical, but let's just try and understand what this means. So, two terms here, homology and analogy. Homology is when you have a trait in a particular organism, and it's similar to a trait in another organism for reasons of common ancestry. So, for instance, if you sort of grab hold of your arm, you can feel there's one bone there, there's two bones there, loads of bones there, and then we've got 5 digits, 5 fingers. So 1 bone, 2 bones, lots of bones, 5 digits. And the same in your leg. And in fact, all land-living animals have that. So that evolved very, very early, and we've all inherited it with slight modifications over time. You can see here, we've got a bat, a bird, and a pterodactyl who all have this same bone structure, and that's called homology. And so we look for evidence of that in the tree of life. On the right-hand side, you can see another thing that happens, and that's called an analogy, when you have what we call convergent evolution. So 2 completely different species that have evolved completely separately and have come further and further apart, but now find themselves in a situation where they have a common problem, and they have to solve it through evolution to come up with a similar sort of solution. And the classic example there is wings. So we can see bat wings, bird wings, and insect wings. They all are trying to solve the problem of flight. But of course, mammals and birds and insects evolved to be completely separate. And we see lots of examples of that. So another principle to understand is that obviously species move. Species go from the sea to the land, from land to the air, from land to the trees, and back again. Some of these species move backwards. We all know about whales and dolphins that used to be land mammals and now they live in the sea. So these are the sort of principles to sort of keep in your mind when you consider the tree of life and looking for evidence for our evolution. And here's a classic example of the sort of thing I'm going to be looking at as we go through. So we all know about the polar bear. The polar bear is the classic bear. And we think that it evolved from a common ancestor, which was probably a brown bear, very recently, about 500,000 years ago. So if you look at a polar bear, it's inherited lots of traits from the brown bear. It looks like a brown bear, really, but it's got some new traits, and obviously the most visible one is that its hair has gone white, and we presume that's for camouflage, so that the bear can approach prey without being spotted. So there's a classic example of the sort of thing we're going to be talking about. Old traits that you inherited from the past, new traits that have helped this species evolve in the future. So, if we now look at this tree of life, I'm going to now walk through from the very beginning through to humans, and we're going to sort of take a little story of how we evolved over time. how we think we evolved over time. So you might think that you don't have much in common with a bacteria. So a bacteria is a tiny, tiny little cell. And you might think, well, I've got nothing in common with that. But in fact, you are made up of trillions of cells. And if you look at each of your cells, that shares a lot of ancestry with the bacteria. Your DNA is exactly the same structure as the bacterial DNA. It's just a different code. It's like the letters of a book. You know, one book versus another book. They're still written with the same letters, but of course it's a different book. So the DNA is inherited. And of course, if you look at a bacteria here, this is Escherichia coli, which you find in your gut. You see these little hair-like things on the side of the membrane. They're called cilia, and we find those structures all over our body in lots of tissues. And the big long whip thing is called a flagellum. You see those too. So a lot of our cell biology is inherited from bacteria. And in fact, within our cells, I mentioned mitochondria earlier, that's actually, we think, a bacteria that's become embedded within our own cell biology. And also within our guts, you've got trillions of bacteria digesting your food right now. So we've become a sort of a multi-species organism. We're like a community of bacteria walking around. Of course, there are lots of things that are new. We're quite different from bacteria, and the main one is multicellular. So, when these organisms started to clump together and form bigger and bigger organisms, there had to be a plan to build a body. There had to be some sort of orientation, up, down, top, bottom, right, left, and little segments so they could build bigger and bigger bodies. And of course that's what happened. So we share common ancestor with all the insects and worms and spiders and all of those types of animals that lived about 590 million years ago. And the main thing that we inherited from that common ancestor was this body plan. We call it bilateral symmetry. So bilateral just means left to right, top to bottom, and symmetrical. And this image of this woman, it's just a mirror image of her face. Our faces are not actually mirror images, but you can see she looks a bit strange because of that. Because this is a sort of an image that was created. So we inherited all of those things from this last common ancestor, and in addition to that, we've got new stuff. We've got an internal skeleton and various other things. So moving on, fish. You know, for millions and millions of years, our ancestors were fish living in the sea, just like they do today. And we have evolved from the common ancestor with fish, and we've inherited a lot of stuff from that common ancestor. If you think of your skeleton, your muscles, the heart that we were talking about earlier, your guts, all of that was inherited from the common ancestor with fish. Of course, we have new stuff as well. We breathe and we move on the land, so we have this limb structure and we have lungs. So the first sort of animals that came onto the land, of course, they had to evolve these lungs to breathe the air, and they had to evolve these pentadactyl limbs that I was talking about to move on land. And of course, we've inherited that from those animals. But as we evolved and became mammals, some of these amphibians became reptiles, and some of them then became mammals. We evolved other things like hair. So we're getting closer now. All of the mammals have been around on this planet for at least 140 million years. So a long, long time before the dinosaurs got extinct, were lots of little animals, probably like rats, running around, not noticed by these big dinosaurs, and our ancestors were there all the way along, living underneath the dinosaurs. And so basically we've inherited from those animals fur, if you're a female, live birth, lactation. And of course, as our ancestors started moving in the trees, we started to evolve primate features. So here's the last common ancestor with the lemur, 63 million years ago. And we inherited from that common ancestor stereoscopic forward-looking vision, colour vision. When you look and you can see colour, it's mainly because our ancestors started to eat fruit in the trees and needed to recognise ripe fruit. And basically that was what we inherited. The primates are a big trait, if you think of all the different monkeys, and there's lots of trends in the primates, and of course that's what we're going to talk about next, these trends. So here's the primates. So on the left-hand side we've got some of these what are called prosimians, the lorises, the lemurs, and then we've got the monkeys in the middle, and over on the right we've got the apes, the gibbons, the lesser apes, and the great apes, the big apes. And of course we're quite a back plane. So the sort of trends that we're talking about are just generally things like fewer and fewer infants and looking after their children more. More quality diet. Rather than just eating insects and fruit, we are omnivorous. We eat lots of different things. Our brains started to grow. And we got bigger just generally. So we had to start climbing vertically up the trees because to be bigger, you need to hold onto a big, thicker branch. So all of these trends are going on until we get really to the great apes, which is us. So if you've been to the zoo, you'll have seen the orangutans there, fantastic collection of beautiful orangutans in a fairly reasonable habitat, which is not too cruel. So putting them in horrible cages, and the orangutans are there. In Africa, we've got the gorilla, and the chimpanzee, and the bonobo, quite closely related. But of course, we've got humans as well. We are great apes. So for me, I think one of the most interesting questions that remains in science is exactly how did that happen, that we became the way we are. So if you look at this here, we can see the chimpanzee and the gorilla, and these are our closest relatives in the animal world. But a surprising fact is that if you look at the DNA or any molecule from a chimpanzee and compare it with a human and a gorilla, we are actually closer to the chimpanzee than they are to the gorilla. And if you look at the, from a human viewpoint, it looks bizarre because we are clearly the odd man out. So if you're an evolutionary biologist, you have to say, well, what was it that happened here? Something quite dramatic must have happened that was very different from what happened to the other primates living in Africa. And so let's just think. Can anyone think of a difference between humans and chimps? Don't be shy. Anyone think of it?
Hair.
Body hair, absolutely. That was not a planted question. Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, so if you think, if you imagine, say, a 12-year-old, they've got this very distinct cap of hair on their head, but they don't tend to have hairy chests, and they're not very hairy compared to a chimpanzee at a young age. Any others?
The brain, size of the brain.
The size of the brain has definitely got much bigger in us compared to chimpanzees. Very good. What about the way they move?
Bipedal.
So we move on 2 legs, whereas chimpanzees tend to walk on their knuckles. They walk bizarrely on their knuckles. And even an orangutan moves on 4 hands most of the time, but it can on 2 legs. So yeah, these are the things. So the way we move, how hairy we are, how big the brain, so great. And the other one, of course, which is probably the most obvious one and the most important one, is language. Chimpanzees and all animals can communicate, but I don't think there are many chimpanzee lectures going on right now where they're talking about their evolution and saying, what we're going to do about these humans taking our habitat over. It's us that are doing that, and that's bizarre. Why are we pointing language at that? So there are lots of models about human evolution out there. There's a thing called the provisioning hypothesis from Owen Lovejoy, and there's various other ones. But the main one, the one that's most popular and is taught all over the world, including this university, can be called the savanna theory. So basically the idea is that climate change happened in Africa, the trees started to spread out and make way for open plains, and our ancestors started to live on the open plains. So we came down from the trees and we started to walk because it was more efficient to walk. We lost our body hair because it was to make sweat cooling more efficient, and we grew big brains and started to communicate so we could hunt better, just to get scavenged better. That's the plan. And there is lots of evidence for it. There's lots of fossil evidence that have been found on the savannas. Our human ancestors were found often with antelope bones and big cats. So it's certainly a pretty reasonable theory. But there's another theory which I'm very interested in, and it came out in the 1960s, and it's called the aquatic ape theory. It sounds a bit strange, and the name aquatic ape sort of invokes images of mermaids or something weird. And I think that was a problem with this idea. But basically, they criticise the savanna theory. They say, well, hold on, why didn't baboons become bipedal when they came down from the trees? Why don't you find other naked mammals walking around on the savannah? Why is it only us? And the brain size, really, you don't find that the brain size growing very much in savannah mammals, and they certainly don't start tall. Maybe there are some better analogies in aquatic mammals. Aquatic mammals seem to have lost their body hair. Some whales sing some beautiful songs to each other, so there's some vocalization going on there. Maybe not language. But these people started to promote this idea. Now, if you look at the vast tree of fossils that have been found, and we look at the habitats of those fossils, you do find that there is some evidence for both sides of the argument. So, for instance, here we've got Lucy. This is from Donny Hanson's book on Lucy, the famous skeleton. And Hagar, the habitat where Lucy lived, was basically a wetland for 1 million years. So very much a wet planet. I'm looking here now at a very early hominid called Sahelanthropus chilensis, and that was found smack bang in the middle of what was Paleolithic Lake Chad. So the habitat was definitely wet and would have been capable of swimming and doing stuff like that. And there are exceptions, of course. Homo naledi, which is a famous fossil that's been recently found, was found in a cave, making it hard to determine what these hominids were doing, but there's not much evidence for water being around there. So it's not one-sided. There are lots of other fossil sites where it's pretty obviously savannah. But probably most important, the most recent sort of fossils that have been found, the earliest modern human fossils that have been found right in Blombos Cave by the Indian Ocean, and there's lots of shell middens. They keep these shells for decoration, which they found in the fossils. So I'm still thinking that the savannah and the water could exist side by side. I'm not thinking it must be one or it must be the other. Can there be something in between? And if we look at swimming, humans are pretty good at swimming. We see people swim over to Rock Nest every year here. We all go in the pool and swim a lot. If you're looking at two species, here a pig and a monkey, and you compare them with a substrate here, for instance, like a tree. Imagine you've got like a pokey